All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We have people still coming into the event tonight, but I do want to be respectful of our panelists and our moderators and everyone who's on and everyone's time. My name is Cameron Marshall. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement at the college and also an alumnus from the class of 2012. We have an incredible crowd for tonight, over 100 people registered this evening, which is fantastic. That's one of our larger virtual events that we've had, so I'm very excited to see that this topic was of such interest. We've been trying to strike a balance between fun, casual events and also more serious and informative topics, and I hope tonight will be both. I hope it'll be fun and informative for you. We have some really great content, some rock star panelists and moderators, so I hope everyone will enjoy. Just one quick housekeeping item. If everyone can please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature, whichever one you choose, to submit any questions or comments that you have for our panelists or moderators tonight. I'll do my best to make sure that I cover all of those questions by the end of our program. And now I'll do a quick introduction. I'm not going to read the full bios because our panelists are very accomplished, and I want to make sure we save as much time as possible for them to be able to get into the bulk of the program tonight, but I'll give you just a brief overview of who we have with us. Adam Lavier, class of 1997, is co-founder of XLV Companies. Their mission is to address policy challenges through private market solutions that employ new technology. Current projects include providing access to low-cost financial services for underserved communities in the U.S., reconfiguring global transportation to minimize cost to individuals while also improving service, and reducing congestion. Fitz Robertson, class of 2009, is part of the Global Strategic Relationships Group and Business Development Group within JP Morgan Asset Management. He's been an employee since 2010 and has over a decade of industry experience. Fitz is responsible for managing strategic relationships within wealth management and investor advisor channels. And David Rouen III, class of 2011, is COO of Superior Medical Equipment, also known as SME. Their company is a national medical distribution company, and David is currently spearheading the company's COVID-19 efforts. So he has some unique perspective of what's happening on the ground with medical distribution. And of course, our moderators tonight need no introduction, Dr. Ken Townsend and Dr. Saranna Thornton. So thank you both for being on here tonight and keeping us on point with all of our topics this evening. I'm going to go ahead and just start off here by throwing out a more general, broad-based question. And Dr. Thornton, if you can get us started and just sort of talk about the kind of information that's out there in the public domain that we're seeing in the media and on social media, and how we should go about processing that information and identifying what's most important and relevant.
That's a great question. So probably everybody has noticed how much information is flooding in about coronavirus and how serious it is or isn't and how we should respond to it. And so I want to encourage people, don't use social media as a source when it comes to COVID-19. There's some good information potentially on Facebook, but there's also a lot of bad information. Same with Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you want to talk about. So what I would say to my students, and what I told them actually back in January when we started talking about this, go use primary sources if you can. So the Johns Hopkins is doing research. The University of Washington has a center doing research. The CDC in the United States try to use primary sources. And if you're going to look at scientific studies or economic studies, use sources that are peer-reviewed.
That's great.
I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, yeah. And can you just maybe throw some of the questions out there? And I know you also had some things that you wanted to share with the group, some slides maybe that had some information on it. So, I really want you and Ken to maybe just go ahead and start getting into the bulk of your topics and ask questions for our panelists tonight and just start this great dialogue on what's happening with the global markets in the midst of this pandemic.
Fantastic. So I'm going to lead off with a little bit of information before we start talking about how this disease impacts what's going on in our economy. We need to understand little bit about what this disease is. So I put together a couple of slides to give people information. I'm not going to read the slides because I have learned from my excellent colleagues in rhetoric that that's a bad idea, but I thought they would be useful for people who want information to take away with them. So some important things is, because this is a new virus that we haven't seen before, we don't have immunity. It's not like the seasonal flu or the common cold in that respect. It has potential to damage a lot of organs in the body, in particular the lungs. It's spread predominantly to a respiratory route, which means if you cough or sneeze or talk loud and there's coronavirus particles in the air, someone else might breathe them in. Another thing that I just wanted to point out real quickly is it's much more lethal than the seasonal flu. I looked up some data on CDC, taking my own advice, and in the 2018-2019 flu season, which lasts about 7 months, there were around 34,000 deaths estimated from seasonal flu. And so far, we're only in the first roughly 100 days of coronavirus infections in the US. We've already topped 100,000 deaths. I put some information on infection fatality rates. So I'm not going to read that, but you can look at it. There's a lot of variation that we're seeing. We still don't know for sure what it is, because when we're looking at infection fatality rates, scientists have to estimate how many people have been infected, and that's different than the case fatality rate. The last thing I wanted to point out, some of the research I've been doing is comparing the lethality of coronavirus to risks we take in our everyday life just to have an economy, to go to work, to go shopping. And one of the stats that I computed was, or actually looked up, but then computed auto deaths in 2018 per 100,000 people, and computed the percent probability there of dying in a fatal car accident. And based on information I found, it's you're 58 to 116 times more likely to die of coronavirus. That's on average. Of course, it varies across states and age groups, but that's the average comparative lethality. The second slide that I have here is just some data on the elderly. And I put myself in this group now. I wasn't there when I first came to Hampden-Sydney, but I've heard some students saying this is not really a big deal. We don't need to worry about it. It's predominantly striking the elderly, and they're not in the labor force anymore. So I went to the FRED, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, data site, another good site for information, and got some information on people 55 and older who are in the labor force. And this data is all from February. I decided to use that because I wanted to use before the virus really hit the economy. And you can see with all this data, I'm not going to read it to you, that the people 55 and older really do make up a significant portion of the labor force. So we shouldn't discount the effect that this virus could have on the macroeconomy, because it predominantly strikes the elderly. Then the sort of second part of this slide, I'm not going to read to you, but I'm going to leave it here because it sets up what I want to show on the third slide. So in order to have herd immunity, scientists estimate 70% to 90% of a population has to become infected. And that prior slide shows how those numbers translate to the US. So for those of you who had economics, and maybe those of you who didn't, hopefully I can explain this in a way that makes sense. I've got a labor market graph for the entire US economy in the top graph. And so the labor supply curve slopes upward. and that shows employees and their ability and willingness to work at different wages. The labor demand curve slopes downward, that's employers, and shows their ability and willingness to hire workers at different real wages. And the initial equilibrium point I've shown is A. So you can think about that as being potentially February of 2020. And then if you go to the bottom graph, that's the production function, which shows how our current amount of capital stock, our current state of technology, and our changes in our labor force, our employment, would combine to produce a certain amount of GDP. And that's also A, you can think about as being February. And that would give us Y1 GDP, which is on the vertical axis. So what are two scenarios? So one scenario I want you to think about is just letting us, let the infection rip through the economy, which we have not decided to do, but that's a scenario that has been discussed. What would happen? Probably deaths between 2 and 3 million. Those people would be out of the labor force. The labor supply curve would shift inward. Other people would get really sick and not be able to work, shifting the labor supply curve inward. The labor demand curve would shift in because we would have a reduction in the productivity of labor. So we'd end up at a new equilibrium B, where we'd have much lower employment, and the changes in wages are ambiguous depending on the relative shift in labor supply and labor demand. Then if you go down to the production function, you see the production function rotating downward and feeding fewer workers into it gives us lower GDP. So the point I want to make here is if we just let the infection rip through the economy, these changes are permanent. People who die aren't coming back to the labor force. Reduced quality of labor isn't going to suddenly magically reappear once herd immunity occurs. So the comparison that I want to make to what we're doing now with quarantine and shutdowns of certain parts of the economy, we still see the same effects, but the effects are transient. And once we're able to reopen the economy, which we're starting to do, and we'll do more broadly as time goes on, the economy will start to come back to where it was initially. So that's my part of the conversation for now. And I will turn it over to Ken.
Yeah, so Dr. Townsend, why don't you share a little bit with us about the environmental outlook on this and how that's impacted the global economy? I know you've had a lot of experience studying abroad in China, and also you've been doing a lot of analyzation of the Chile environmental impact on things and their economy. So maybe give us a little bit on that, and then hopefully we can dig in with our panelists here now that we've had sort of the broad look with Dr. Thornton's background on COVID and how it's generally impacting the economy. Dr. Townsend will give us this unique environmental impact perspective, and then we can dig into the nuts and bolts of different trends and how things are looking with the different US and global markets with some of our panelists. And our panelists should also feel free to chime in at any point.
Hey, Cameron, as a procedural matter, would it be helpful to allow us at least to talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes with Dr. Thornton, since she just laid that out? Absolutely. And then maybe shift to Dr. Townsend rather than holding all our questions and comments to the end?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, if y'all have anything on anything Dr. Thornton just shared, please go ahead.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll start. Thank you for laying all that out. And I think your point about information and the consumption that we're essentially drinking from a fire hose on, being able to discern between what's useful and useless information is critical, because I do think that the broader media is failing us on this. And part of it is not their fault insofar as we, of course, don't have a great understanding of this disease. It's constantly evolving. And I think everybody on this, in this teleconference, video conference would agree it would be great if we could all have a lot of peer-reviewed studies that are analyzing different dimensions of this. But the reality is it's extremely limited, at least in the scientific literature to date. So we're forced to deal with imperfect information. And that creates what I'm sure is going to set up for some of the panelists to discuss later, a suboptimal set of decision making that we see. So that's one point I'll make. The second point that I'll make, and I'd be curious to hear people. So when we compare this disease to similar respiratory related diseases in the past, so you note that there are pneumonia-like symptoms, SARS, which we're familiar with from the Asia epidemics, and the flu, which people have been pointing to in the press. Our dear president loves to quote that, although less so these days. There's a lot of variation in the fatality in flu. So you picked a season that was unusually low. So if you go back 2 years and look at the 2017-2018 flu season, the death count is actually closer to 80,000. So there's a lot of variation in that. And so it's, I think as a broad brush, we're right to take pause and think about how deadly this disease is. But at the same time, we need to take stock of what this looks like relative to various things that we've been managing in our healthcare system over time. And then the last point that I'll make is on the fatality rate of this thing in particular. There's a great debate that I'm sure we're all following now. And as you point out in the slide, it's really unknown. And it's unknown because we don't know what the denominator is. And that is a function of logistical problems in our country, as well as a failure of, I would argue, good governance. So we just don't have the testing. And I'll throw out one interesting data point, which is we use random sampling for so many things in this country, including the CDC constantly for disease-oriented stuff. I find it surprising that the CDC has neither conducted nor published information using random sampling for antibodies, as an example, or even testing. We seem to have defaulted into this federated system of ignorance. And I, as a taxpayer and as a citizen with children and elder relatives, I find that extremely disturbing and surprising at this stage of the crisis. So I wanted to offer those comments in response to what you kindly laid out for us.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there. So I think thank you both for your comments around that. I just wanted to put some numbers to it. I would say, you know, it's been really interesting. I'm in New York and seeing the death rates, the death toll on a daily basis has been, you know, kind of daunting. We hit 97 deaths on this past weekend, and people were cheering, you know, which is, it's still, this is people's lives. This is really important. So first and foremost, my heart goes out to anyone on the line that's been infected in any way, unemployment, health, family, friends. As part of the Hampden-Sydney family, we love you, and you know it's really unfortunate. Around the numbers itself, I believe you've all seen the news, but from a overall case perspective, you know we had over 100,000 deaths in the U.S. alone, according to the New York Times, and you know that is a largest toll of a number of U.S. military combat fatalities since the Korean War. And, you know, it matches close to the toll of the 1968 flu pandemic. And holistically, you know, it could potentially get closer to the 1918 flu pandemic, which was over 675,000. But I think, to your point, we don't know where this is going. I think that the things that we have done around shutdown, quarantine has played an important role. But as Dr. Townsend and I were talking about before the call opened, South Korea took, you know, very aggressive measures around testing, things of that nature, quarantine, and they opened up prior to the United States doing so, and they're starting to see spikes once again. So we need to be very careful about how we go about opening. And to your point, Adam, the testing is just not there, right? People talking about antibody testing, but what about testing people for COVID-19 when we know that the virus in many cases is asymptomatic? So we have a lot to do, but I think as long as we can try to protect ourselves and families and try to do the right thing around this, puts us in a better place.
I would certainly agree that the news is failing us in large measure. Consider, I don't believe that there has ever been a vaccine developed for any coronavirus. And so we're saying we're going to get a vaccine for this coronavirus within a year. People are saying within 6 months. That would be a wonderful almost miraculous happenstance, given that there has never been a vaccine for any coronavirus. But you just don't hear much about that. The news media are not reporting that very simple fact. Maybe it's too daunting for people to take in. On a lighter note, maybe I'll talk about the environment now. A piece of good news. The other professor on the panel here, I also have some charts. Let me share. Sorry for the dead space. Okay, what you should see now on your screen is a panel of photographs. The top panel is satellite photography over Wuhan from January of 2019 through February of 2019, with the center picture being a photograph during Chinese New Year, which in 2019 was at the end of January. In 2020, it was in the beginning of February, I think February 5th. Now, if you look at the bottom panels, this is Wuhan during January through February of 2020, and there's a dramatic difference. The top panels are showing you very high levels of tropospheric nitric oxide emissions over Wuhan. These are NOx and SOx, or the common pollutants that accumulate in the atmosphere when we burn hydrocarbon fossil fuels. And Wuhan is an important major Chinese industrial center. And so you can see that in January before the new year, they had pretty high levels of NOx emissions. In February, after the new year, very high levels of NOx density measured in the atmosphere. By comparison, in January of 2020 through February of 2020, when Wuhan was experiencing its peak with COVID-19, the levels are much, much less if you look down at the scale on the bottom. So the environment in Wuhan got much cleaner if we look at air pollution. Well, by any measure of any pollution, Wuhan got a lot cleaner. Indeed, so did the rest of the world. And that's good news. The environment has patently improved during the pandemic. Why? Well, the economy, the global economy, is operating at a reduced level of activity. And so we don't have the same levels of air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, or even noise pollution that we had last year this time. And I'm sure Fitz experiences this when he's in downtown Manhattan or lower Manhattan. It's pretty quiet. The noise pollution just isn't the same as it was a year ago. So there's a sharp reduction in pollution. Here's a dramatic photograph. This is from Kathmandu in Nepal. About 100 miles north of Kathmandu, we have a mountain range in the very far reaches of this picture. That's underneath that arrow. That's Mount Everest back there. That's 100 miles north of Kathmandu. Kathmandu's in a valley, then you've got a near mountain range, then a farther mountain range, and across that mountain range, way over in Tibet, you've got things like K2 and Everest and whatnot. Now, ordinarily, you cannot see that mountain range from Kathmandu, but as a consequence of the reduction in pollution, you can. So you can actually see 100 miles away. So the good news of the pandemic, the pollution levels are markedly lower. Now, will those be permanent reductions in pollution? I don't think so. Will they alter the long-term trend toward higher global levels of pollution, or only the short-term level of pollution? I've got an idea about that. To compare it to something, this is a time series from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, showing the level of gross national product from 1933, the depth of the Great Depression, through 1953, and measured against that, we've got household consumption. And you can see the long-term trend was for consumption to steadily rise linearly as gross national product rose. So the higher the level of national income, the higher the level of household consumption. But there was a period of time from 1942 through 1945 when things fell. That was because we were rationing during World War II. The Office of Price Administration was severely rationing household consumption of tires, automobiles, all sorts of things. Households were issued ration books that determined what they could purchase. Now, did it alter the long-term trend, the rate at which consumption changed over time? No. In fact, the trend stayed the same. It was just a dislocation, if you will, of the intercept of that relationship between consumption and GNP. And I think that's what we're going to see vis-a-vis consumption, not consumption, pollution of all sorts, and the pandemic here. When the pandemic is off, I think we're going to experience something like this. During the pandemic, we're experiencing pollution levels that are going to be at the same long-term trend rate, but they're just down now because the economy is down. As GDP is down, the level of pollution is down. But if GDP snaps back, the level of pollution, like the level of consumption, will snap back, in my estimation. Why? Well, the environment is a normal good. As incomes rise, the demand for environmental quality also rises. We're experiencing steep decreases in incomes right now due to COVID, and that's causing a decrease in the demand for environmental quality. Now, that's different than saying the environmental quality is increasing or decreasing. Consumers' desire for environmental quality is decreasing. Here's another diagram. This is called the environmental Kuznets curve. It's something we can attribute to economist Simon Kuznets, who described it not with regard to the environment, but with regard to income inequality. He pointed out that on the vertical axis, he had income inequality, and showed that as per capita incomes increased, income inequality increased as we went from being essentially an agrarian economy to being an industrial economy. Industrial economies had the greatest level of income inequality. As we entered a post-industrial phase, Kuznets conjectured that we would have greater income equality, and he called this back-bending curve. Well, he didn't call it a Kuznets curve, but everybody else calls it a Kuznets curve. Well, with regard to the environment, environmental degradation increases as we go from a small agrarian economy to an industrial economy. As we become a post-industrial economy, the environment improves. But why is that? Well, it's because as incomes increase per capita, beyond some point, our desire for environmental quality increases. And so we demand better environmental quality. But right now with the pandemic, our incomes are dropping fairly sharply. They're down. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, projection for second quarter per capita incomes, they'll be off on an annual basis in the second quarter. If we calculate them at an annualized rate, they say 40%. My models show more like 20%, but somewhere between 20 and 40%. If that's true, then the public would be willing to accept less environmental quality. Now, what I'm suggesting is that that means that the time is right for policymakers to offer deregulation to the public. And that's what's happening right now in Washington. The current administration in Washington is suggesting that we deregulate the EPA. And in Brazil, Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, is doing the same thing with the Brazilian economy. They're deforesting the Amazon at a very rapid pace, which will have a telling effect on environmental quality. But it's because the public is willing to accept, given the lower levels of per capita income, less environmental quality. Now, long term, will they? Maybe not, but in the near term, they will. I'm going to stop right there so that we can either have questions from the rest of the panel, or we can move on to other panel ideas.
Hey, do any of our panelists have any feedback on that, or want to chime in with any thoughts on that part of it?
Obviously, Ken, the deregulation is something that's been happening from several years just in those two countries that you cite alone.
Yeah, that's
despite
true.
the fact that if you think about Brazil, post their most recent recession, the per capita income has been improving, albeit the lasting inequality problem, just putting that off to the side, that they experience. And certainly here in the US, real wages have been stagnating, but we've not had that per capita contraction that your per capita income contraction that you're citing. But I would argue that both things seem to be very, I guess, partisan driven in those two cases that you've cited. But perhaps that's the wrong way to frame it. Perhaps there is more of an underlying macroeconomic trend and correlation between the two things. So how would you think about what was happening before COVID hits and the behavior that was accepted and vis-a-vis the environmental regulation?
I would agree with you that before COVID, that there probably was a strong partisan drive to deregulate. But I would suggest to you now that there's probably a broad meta-partisan receptivity to such deregulation, at least in the near term. That you take people's income and you crush it like an aluminum can, and people are thinking, oh, I want a job. You know, environmental quality, maybe later on, but I would like a job. So
I do want to hear from David Rowan, because you have a very interesting perspective of some of the things that are happening from a supplier side of PPE equipment, and, you know, touching on Saranna's point about, you know, what we're hearing in the media and some of the inconsistencies that several of our panelists touched on about what we're seeing and what's actually happening. David, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening from a PPE supplier side?
Thank you. Well, from the distribution end, there's one thing that really relates to the media, and that's the word price gouging. And that's a word that it's definitely going on. There are a lot of people out there that are in the mix. There's a lot of these so-called brokers that are popping up out of nowhere, and they're flipping masks. A lot of them are fraudulent masks. They're fakes. You should not be buying them. But for real medical distributors like ourselves, is the prices have definitely gone up, and it's not by our own choice. A lot has to do with the cost of the raw material. I was telling everyone earlier today that the price of one of the most important materials in face mask is melted blown felt, and that material in January was $3,000 a ton, and now it's over $80,000 a ton. It's just, we're running out of materials. So the prices are going up. And every time I turn on the media, I'm hearing about price gouging. I'm also seeing face masks seized, which is great. There's a lot of counterfeits out there. We get calls all the time from customers. They're asking all the right questions about their face mask, because this is something that actually protects you. This is something that's going to protect you and your patients that come in your clinic. You need to make sure that you're having the right product. And it's just a crazy time in the supply end. But that's the big thing with the media going on right now in our industry.
And Fitz, I want to touch on some of your background in global business relations too. You know, you deal with a lot of companies and see a lot of trends and how people are pivoting during this time. And, just curious about what you're seeing globally with maybe some of our businesses here in the US as well. How are companies shifting their focus? And especially for our students, because we do have a number of students on tonight, what opportunities are still out there for them? A lot of internships are being canceled, a lot of jobs are being laid off. What sort of trends are you seeing in the industry, both globally and here domestically?
Yeah, so appreciate that. So fortunately, as you mentioned around jobs, since mid-March, we had over 40 million jobs, unemployment claims itself, which in essence means, 1 out of every 4 individuals in the U.S. are currently unemployed or taking unemployment claims. So across, we have a 14.7% unemployment rate, and it went up dramatically and very quickly from 3.5%. But it's been really interesting, historically, we have seen often when there's crisis, there are fundamental shifts in the economy and social behavior. And just as a couple of reference points, 1930s, Great Depression, it stimulated economic protectionism, foundations of Second World War, but also boosted resourcefulness, productivity, innovation. World War II brought more women to the workforce than ever, which has been known to be one of the best things for our economy thus far. 2008, 2009 global financial crisis brought around anti-establishment, more structure around banking, and today's environment, is no different. It's going to bring around a number of different things. We've realized, like, even with the technology we're doing today, like, we're thinking better, we're living different, we're working different, we're learning different, and travel and entertainment is very different. So, the virus holistically is not gonna completely reset behaviors. However, it will dramatically change global trends and kind of speed things up. So, the CEO of Microsoft said that, a trend that was supposed to last 2 years in digital transformation happened in 2 months. And you see that across the board from companies like Zoom, which we're using today. They were a small company not being highly leveraged. And when this happened, they took off and their stock, quadrupled. So you see that quite aggressively, and you see this is going to be really interesting coming out of it. So to your point around trends and themes, a couple of things that come to mind. So one being deglobalization, and it goes back to kind of what David touched on when COVID-19 hit U.S. in particular. It was really hard to get masks, really hard to get ventilators, really hard to get the necessary tools that we needed because it was all produced in China. So we see a trend, things are coming back home, and there'll be jobs that kind of go around that. And then you also see the news around protectionism. So 2 being the everything economy, and then 3, really focusing on, I would say, next-gen infrastructure, which would be 5G, fiber optics, medical equipment, and then 4 being biosecurity. I think things of that nature around technologies, around smart cities is really important. I would say 6, cybersecurity, and we know that with all of the various data crimes that are out there, and things that are happening globally, it's becoming more and more important. And then lastly, artificial intelligence, and I think that's a big opportunity for our alum, for our current students. Big data, predictive health, analytics, everything around drug discovery. So I graduated from business school 2 years ago, and I do a fair amount of recruiting, go to a fair amount of recruiting events. And before all this happened, and even now on some digital activities, we see most of the jobs are very heavily leveraged towards data, medical, sales. So anything in those areas that I kind of highlighted around technology, medicine, and the areas I kind of highlight that around it being finance, being sales, but getting a deep understanding in those areas would be really important. So I would behoove everyone, especially those in school, to learn how to code, learn how to use Excel to the utmost degree, being VBA, and get really proficient at it, because that's how you're going to be measured. But having a deep understanding in technology And if you choose to go down the medical field, a lot of doors will be open to you.
Great, thank you, Fitz. Anybody want to comment on any of that before we move
Yeah, I would like to comment if you wouldn't mind. Just really quick, on the lines of pivoting, is I have to just tell you just a quick story, but right now with FEMA buying up all the major brands, 3M, Halyard, they're buying up everything. It leaves distributors like us to turn to the secondary market. So anyway, long story short, I found a company about 3 hours away from our headquarters that had masks in stock, ready to go. And we pretty much bought the whole lot. And they said, I was like, hey, can you ship out today? And they said, better yet, we're gonna load it up in a massive truck and drive it down, even better. So they showed up, pulled up to the warehouse, we're unloading all the masks. And I'm talking to them and saying, have you guys been in Greensboro this whole time? And I didn't even know that there was another medical company out there. And they said, no, we're actually in the textile industry. And turns out they actually are one of the largest manufacturers for curtains on cruise ships. And they had this huge warehouse in Greensboro filled with these really beautiful fabrics and textiles. And right now with cruise lines, their business is totally dead. So on a dime, with all their Chinese and overseas connections, they started importing PPE products. And right now, business is thriving. They're actually selling to a lot of different agencies in the state of North Carolina. They're doing very good, but they totally pivoted on a dime, and it's saving their company. It's saving the families that work there, and it's really, really great to see. And I just had to share that with you. Second thing is that if there's anybody out there that is looking to get into medical, find me. Give me a call.
Thank you, David. And while we have you talking about PPE, what do you think the future for those products is going to look like? There's a lot of conversation out there. I was watching the news this afternoon, and there was talk about how this high demand for PPE and other similar products is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. This pandemic has completely transformed the medical industry in ways that we're going to see long term. Do you have any insights on that? And I don't mean to put you on the spot with that question, but anything you can offer there would be great. Any sort of predictions?
Yeah, thank you.
Give you an environmental insight into that.
And well, just to be clear, I mean, the majority of our business has been mostly supplies. I mean, we're used to building up weight rooms, athletic training facilities, supplying hospitals with all the products that when you walk in, you see. PPE was a really, really small sector of our overall business. Now it's our top sector. Now that clinics are starting to reopen, things are starting to balance out, but that PPE sector is definitely not going to go away anytime soon. And to answer your question about future, the future outlook of PPE products, it's not going away anytime soon. I know in Virginia, they just announced effective tomorrow, you need to be wearing your face mask out in public. And I'll tell you this, on the back end, Virginia's not going to be the only state. More states are going to follow suit. I'm here in North Carolina. Technically, North Carolina is going to be next. And this is going to roll into the school year. Schools are going to be putting a lot of sanitation mandates in place, hand sanitizer pumps all over the place, face mask. A lot of state schools are definitely going to be going down that route. We're going to be looking at those scanners. Actually, I had a conversation today about the scanners that students can walk up to, put their face up to. The scanner will actually lock the door if you're not wearing a face mask, and it will actually lock the door if your temperature's high. So these products, I think we're entering a new normal where we realize what can potentially happen with all of us in this world. And I think with that looming over our shoulders and looking about what is going on, how this is affecting our country and our families, it's not going to go away. We're going to be seeing face masks out in public for a long time. Hand sanitizer, gloves, sanitation. And I know with the environment, we're definitely going to be continuing to see trends like that for sure.
Thank you.
Pop quiz.
And you said you had an environmental angle on that point?
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. Here's a pop quiz. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but true or false, pandemics occur at random intervals?
I'll say that's false.
Anybody else?
I go with false.
Adam?
It's a semantic issue. Define random in this case.
Okay. For working purposes, we'll use pseudo-random as in random in Excel. If it's random enough to qualify for equals rand, that's random enough.
Over the entire history of the known world, I'll say yes, it's likely random. But I assume you're modeling over the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, I think that if you looked over a long enough interval, it would appear random. But here's the thing. Environmental scientists are noticing that as the human endeavor, that's the phrase I'm going to use to describe all of us, all of our things, all of our activities, the human endeavor, as the human endeavor increases in its scope, its complexity, and most importantly, its size, we push out farther and farther globally into the far reaches. And we come into contact with things like the horseshoe bat near Wuhan, or the wolverine, which for the first time ever is now on the beach in the state of Washington. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with anything? Only this: these pandemics are caused in large measure by viruses that are harbored by organisms other than us, organisms that 600 years ago we didn't encounter with any frequency. But 6 years ago, we are encountering with much greater frequency. The more of us, the more of our things, the greater our scale size, the greater the frequency of our encounters with these other organisms like the horseshoe bat, and the greater the probability of zoonotic transfer from another species to humans of these viruses. So the point that I think would tie in with what David was suggesting is that we're going to be seeing more viral transmission from bats and other organisms to humans. We're going to see more pandemics, not fewer pandemics, not random pandemics, but more pandemics, I believe, over time. And so PPE is going to be a hot item for ... for as long as anyone cares to think about investing in PPE.
That's a really
I'd like to-
pandemics.
I'd like to pop out a question to David real quickly. One of the things I've been following a lot is all the colleges that are planning to reopen for online classes in the fall. And I just quickly looked up at the Department of Education, and there's approximately, in the most recent data, 26 million students enrolled in US higher education institutions, approximately 4 million employees, so a little over 30 million people. Some of those, employees are being told that they're going to work from home, but what's going to happen in July and August whenever 6,000 institutions of higher education start trying to buy masks for their students, faculty, and staff? And can you get Hampden-Sydney somehow to the top of the list?
Hey, Dr. Thornton, you are at the top of the list for sure. We definitely have Hampden-Sydney covered. And regarding your question, it's actually really interesting because I'm actually working with a school down here in North Carolina. As early, like this morning, we're actually talking to them about making student kits for all the students coming back. I mean, it's gonna be thousands and thousands of kits. And they're asking for all the hot items. And yeah, you're right. We know that we're anticipating a huge surge of these schools looking for all the same products. What I will tell you is I actually went out to the school. They're about 2 hours away from us, and went out there last week, and she showed me the supply closet. They are totally stacked with products already, but they're going to need more with everything that they're planning. And it's a North Carolina school. It's a part of the North Carolina school system. But yeah, they're definitely going to need more. This particular school's looking at opening on August the 1st, so a little earlier than usual. And from my understanding is that they're going to when Thanksgiving comes, they're going to send the students home and continue online. But yeah, you're right. From a distributor standpoint, we are looking at a huge boom that's going to happen eventually. The schools that are snoozing, it's going to be slim pickings. And my recommendation to any school out there is to start preparing and getting ready. The only thing that's going to stop and put students at home, because student safety is #1 priority, is going to be if we start seeing a spike. It's going into the summer months. 4th of July is right around the corner. We just had Memorial Day weekend. But if we start seeing spikes, I really do believe that schools are going to seriously consider going online in the fall. Otherwise, it's full steam ahead, protect yourselves, and it's going to get pretty crazy with supplies.
So I have one quick follow-up question. Should I start sewing masks now for my son who's going back to college in the fall?
It's a great question. I mean, I would love to sell you some masks.
Okay.
I personally have a reusable, yeah. I personally have a reusable mask myself, and I think that, like, quite honestly, I look at the military. Early on, the military actually went with a reusable mask. That was back in like mid-March. They actually were using a 4-layer reusable mask with a silver fill, which is antimicrobial. So they went to that, and now they're all moving to N95s. So when I start seeing a trend like that, there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions about coronavirus and how it spreads still. I mean, wasn't last week they just talked about the effects, and it may not spread on the surface as much as we thought it was. So with that being said, with all the uncertainty, I would definitely recommend going with the disposable. That's just my recommendation, as long as it's a quality one for sure. But reusables are fine. I'm wearing one. So your call.
Thank you.
So we are getting towards the top of the hour, and I want to make sure we get a really important point that was raised the other day when we were all talking about various topics that we might touch on, because I know, anytime you're talking about the economy and the way things are going, I could probably keep this crowd on all night long talking about and debating different things. But Adam, a point was raised during our conversation earlier in the week that the economy didn't necessarily tank like it did in other recessions and other, international issues that have arisen. Why is that? What is the cause of this price bounce back in the market? And I offer this up for any of our panelists to continue to chime in and debate on your opinion of this as well.
Thank you, Cameron. Okay, so I'm going to try to hit 3 questions as quickly as possible since we've been on nearly an hour. 1, why have U.S. financial markets rallied so much despite what seems like a very deep recession? 2, what are the threats to that rally? And 3, what should investors take away from this crisis, at least thus far? So on the apparent disconnect, as Fitz was alluding to earlier, we've got an unemployment rate that we have not seen since we started collecting data post-war. The Fed economists actually estimate that private sector employment fell 22% in about 2 months between mid-February and April. Labor force participation fell to 60%, lowest level since 1973. And you've probably been reading that there are salary cuts and underemployment happening all over the place. So the contraction on the labor side has been immense. Also on the supply side, capacity utilization is down to 65%, slowly ticking up again, but I'll get back to that. And GDP contraction, people are trying to estimate like how much is this shocking the overall economy. If I use kind of a basic Okun's Law relationship between employment and growth, it suggests that COVID-19 has knocked our real economy down by somewhere between 25 to 27%. And that the second quarter contraction relative to the first quarter of this year could be around 50% off. But that's immense. Well, what are financial markets doing? And here I'll try to share my screen. There we go. Looking at the ubiquitous Fred data. So I'm just picking the S&P 500. So starting off with equity markets, you see what happened. Drag my cursor over here. You see what happened.
Adam, we actually can't see the screen right now.
Can you see my screen?
No, we can't.
All right, give me a second. Thank you for letting me know. Come back to this. Okay. How about now?
It's coming up now. Yep, there you are.
Great, thank you. Okay, so looking at US equity markets, what you see is we had this massive drop, but Equity markets have come back over 30%. That's typically the case, you know, kind of across all of them. Although the smaller cap stocks have not come back quite as much. And so all of a sudden we're now 11% off all-time peak, despite the fact that we're having this massive contraction in our economy. Corporate bonds. Large corporations still have access to the debt markets. We'll talk about why that is. But you see corporate bond spreads blew way out, which means the cost of borrowing for a lot of these people increased by a factor of 4 or 5 in a very short period of time, which means the debt markets effectively shut down. This is what our Treasury or our Federal Reserve was responding to. Again, we're going to come back to this. But they too have come back down. So they're about half, depending on the quality of the paper that we're looking at what they were just a few months ago. Corporate bond issuance has since ticked up. We're seeing a record amount of issuance. About $500 billion of corporate debt has been issued in investment grade paper over the past 2 months. That is huge, huge. High yield bond markets are not quite as far back, but here's where we see the difference. If you see the CAA rated stuff, so these are companies that are considered junk or somewhat distressed, they are still pretty close to the nadir that you're seeing in the crisis. But the investment grade, the stuff that's closer to investment grade is coming back up. I'll come back to this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, see if I can figure this out. There we go. Okay. All right, so why is this happening? Why does it look like our financial markets are totally divorced from reality here? One reason is government policy. So monetary policy, we see the Federal Reserve, whereas they've already dropped rates about as much as they can, and they've started massive security purchases again. So what are they doing? They're essentially monetizing the debt that we're issuing in size on the fiscal side. So they're buying a lot of Treasury and a lot of mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie and Freddie. That's not new. I had the good and bad fortune of working under the administration during the last financial crisis, and the Federal Reserve was throwing all their spaghetti against the wall then. What's new here is the Fed stepped up and said, in addition to that, essentially we're buying government debt, we're going to use our special authority to establish a corporate bond purchase program. So we're going to backstop the corporate bond market in the United States. Nobody else in the world is doing this. And they have $750 billion of purchasing power to do this. Now, to date, how much have they bought? About $2 billion. And that's exactly what you want to happen in this case. You want signaling strength here. So the market is rallying to the extent that it has on the corporate debt side because the Fed has stepped in and said, we will be the buyer of last resort, don't worry about it. And as a result, that's given a lot of people confidence to come back into the market. On the fiscal side, as everybody's read, we've had a lot of pieces of legislation that's had a budgetary impact, about $2.7 trillion over 2 fiscal years. First, public health response, and the latter ones were supposed to be bridges for workers and businesses. However, there's a lot of questions in terms of whether more is needed, but those 2 punches, monetary and fiscal policy, have had a huge impact on the markets. In particular, if you think about the equity market rebound, the Fed is signaling that it's going to be low, long, and a buyer for a long period of time. It's really shifting purchasing. Second point, high frequency data are starting to improve. It's slight, but the signals are that the bad news is slowing at least. So continued jobless claims, for example, fell 4 million to about 21 million this past week. Good sign. Going back to this, let's see if I can share a screen one last time to show you this. Okay, can figure this out someday. Okay, so the left-hand chart, I'm borrowing these from people who are far smarter than me. What you see are aggregate trends in US mobility. So this is fascinating because you can actually see what you've been reading about. As an example, people were told to stay home, so movements around your house, kind of the immediate vicinity, ticked up big time. Everybody's going to the grocery store, you see that light blue line, but people are no longer going to work. You see that dip. So what you see is there's some uptick in the massive shift that you've had in terms of people going to work. It's slow, but this is just in the last like 3 or 4 weeks. At the same time, there's a way to extrapolate what we think capacity utilization looks like as a function of mobility. It's another modeling exercise, but what you see is the implied rate is coming up from that bottom around 65% that we talked about before. Yeah, I can move faster now. Okay, so those are good signs. GDP forecast, people believe that there's going to be a sharp bounce in the third quarter, but consensus projections seem to agree that real output's not going to return to where we were from 2019 Q4, probably until around 2 years. And you can contrast that with what happened after the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. It took about 3 years. Another factor for why the market's rallying, there's a hope for effective treatment. Ken talked about the fact that vaccine hope in the next 6 to 9 months is likely naive, although people are spending a ton of money getting ready for that possibility. What I find more reassuring is the fact that there are antiviral and steroid-based treatments for the disease as it exists today that makes it much more manageable. I've seen data on treatments, on steroid-based treatments that have switched things from going on a ventilator, probability of death around 50%, to walking out of a hospital with a probability of 80 to 90% within the first 7 days. So we're getting better at treating the disease as we get smarter with it. Subsequent wave fears. There are some market participants that believe the most vulnerable have been hit the hardest. And then the second bit of good news that I would say on this, potential good news, is that instead of seeing the 80% herd immunity target that people debate, we seem to be trending towards 20%, a 20% exposure threshold in some hard-hit areas, some of which in their region or Iran that implemented little to no containment measures. And then New York City that obviously extremely dense, that got hit early in this, and arguably this thing got out of control before the containment measures could have significant effectiveness. We're all seeing kind of the exposure threshold topping out around 20%, and strangely, Sweden's now trending in that direction as well. So it's not definitive, but it is a cause for hope. Last two factors, comparative returns. Government bond yields are barely positive in the US, and they're negative in Japan and Europe. Institutional money managers need to invest somewhere. European equities are in the toilet in several countries, and unlikely, even absent COVID, to rally that much soon. So looking comparatively, US equity markets are a very attractive target for investors. And the last thing I will say, and I mentioned this to the panelists the other day in kind of a glib way, but I do think it matters here. The market structure and incentives. Money managers are generally incentivized to be invested in a bull market. You couple that with the fact that owners of money want positive returns. It tends to feed on itself. And then there's a technical dimension to this, which is shorting the market is tricky and often expensive. So the countervailing forces where you see dips have a hard time holding up for a long period of time. Okay, final 2 points, threats to the rally and takeaways from the crisis. So subsequent COVID waves and potential shutdowns are the things most cited. So if we get a big second wave and states start locking down again, that could put our economy really on a precipice of a long-term persistent downward spiral. So I think if you see that, there's definitely going to be a strong market reaction. There's a lot of room for policymaking areas here, in particular fiscal measures. States need money, and only about $150 billion of the nearly $3 trillion that's been authorized has been allocated to state and local governments. That's likely less than half the loss of revenues they're experiencing. So bear in mind, states operate under a kind of de facto balanced budget restrictions. So they are forced to implement massive cuts right now as revenues shrink. Small businesses, frankly, likely need a longer bridge than they got. And right now, partisan bickering in the district, if I had to put my money on it, you probably have some replenishment of the small business programs, but I don't have a lot of hope that the states are going to get a big jump in funds. There's some corporate austerity and cost cutting happening. There's a question of whether you're going to have persistently depressed demand as a result. I do think that starts to turn if we don't get huge second and third waves. And then lastly, you get the prospect of a banking crisis where you can get tightening credit conditions. I think the Fed has signaled that it's going to prevent that at all costs, so I wouldn't worry too much about that one. But here's some takeaways that I would suggest thinking about. One, on the policy side, incentives lead to very bad responses. As you've seen throughout this, both here and abroad, our incentive structure in politics is really tilted towards short-term and positive assumptions. It's really not set up to deal with long-term fiscal, social, and economic problems like debt, healthcare, environment. And there are things that we can do to address this that we've tried in the past, campaign finance reform being the most obvious. The one thing that I would suggest to people who have some buttons on or some weight on the scales of how policy is done, at least in DC, congressionally authorized commissions with real teeth. I think when you get people who know how to actually run businesses and do things in there that can balance things with policymakers to try to come up with something that could be voted up or down in Congress, that's something I wish we had more of coming out of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. The second thing I would point out is crisis management capability is largely non-existent, at least in the federal government and many states. There are exceptions. The military, FEMA, CDC are better than most, but at least the latter two have proven grossly inadequate in this crisis. I don't have a great solution for that at the federal level. The best idea I've had is some type of Office of Management Budget SWAT team. It's the one place where the government actually comes together on the executive side. But as you've seen when people have been brainstorming about ways to get business started back up, it's just not well informed about how businesses are operating. One thing that I find disturbing is that preventative or preemptive spending is persistently unpopular outside of a crisis. We've got to overcome that. This is a good instance of $10 billion spent on research and responsive systems on this could have a large impact both on health and the economy. The last 2 points I would say here, following up on Ken, there's science's influence here, and this comes to the media point. Policymakers have had really a lot of trouble learning as data and studies on this have become available. And as a result, they're reverting to blunt instrument responses on the policy side. Certainly have no real personal problem with face masks or social distancing per se, but I would argue that the former is not grounded in terms of asymptomatic transmission to people in any actual studies that have been done to date. And before we impose the burden on people who are aged 4 to 18 that have massive risk of surface contamination, the requirement of wearing masks, it would be helpful to try to evaluate through studies over the next 4 to 5 months, the probability of asymptomatic transmission to people, because the data that have come out thus far from other countries, Denmark and Norway would be 2 examples, are indicating that there's actually no change in transmission rate despite the fact that they have allowed schools to reopen. And the burden on students is immense. Finally, on the global coordination front, it's unpopular right now to talk about it, but at least in this area, we've got to step up and start working together. So if we want to start trade wars, which I think are suspect to begin with, that's one thing. But to cut off our involvement in global institutions on issues of science, and in particular on health issues like this, is criminal. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Adam. I appreciate all of that insight and all of that perspective from your experiences and some of the trends that you're seeing out there. If anybody has any final remarks or any response to anything Adam just outlined, I'll give you just a couple minutes here to do that. We are 15 over the hour, so I want to try to be respectful of everyone's time. We have held on to our crowd tonight despite that, so I guess we've piqued their interest, so that's great. But if anybody has any quick response to anything Adam just outlined, please go ahead. All right. Seeing none, I will thank you all for your time this evening. You are all very accomplished in your respective roles at your companies, and we love to showcase your success and your expertise and create opportunities like this. We couldn't do it without very accomplished and engaged alumni like you, so thank you for making this possible tonight. Thank you, Dr. Thornton and Dr. Townsend, for representing Hampden-Sydney so well and bringing your unique area of expertise to the floor tonight. And thank you to everyone who attended and held on with us past the hour. I hope you enjoyed it. I would encourage all of you to tune in for our event next week, June 4th at 6 p.m. We have an election on the 2020, or sorry, a panel on the 2020 election with Dr. Eric Sands, Dr. Joe Lane, and Charlie Hurt, who are 3 of our alumni, and it'll be moderated by Dr. Jim Pontuso. So if you have any interest in the election and hearing what our alumni have to say about that, please be sure to tune in. Everyone have a great night, stay healthy, and go Tigers.
Hey, Cameron, can I say one thing?
Thank you.
Sure.
This would not have occurred without the outstanding initiative and work of Cameron Marshall, and I want to thank Cameron for everything that he has done to bring this about.
Well, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. I did not pay him to say that. I promise. Y'all have a great night. Thank you so much.